Welcome to Under the Lid, a rat-tail podcast about board games and everything that's inside. Join your host, Gimo Barrera, with our special guest on episode 6, where we will dive under the lid of fantasy. So technically I lied in the intro because it's not necessarily about board games, it's about the fantasy genre. And therefore here I have the expert of all fantasy, probably the most sophisticated person I know, Becky. Introduce yourself.
Hey, that's a pretty big opening. I don't know if I would say I'm the expert of all fantasy.
So not only is she the expert of all fantasy, so if you ever have a question about fantasy, you can send it our way. We'll send it to Becky and she'll give you the correct answer.
I'll give it a try.
Yeah. Fantasy is very objective. There's nothing subjective about the genre of fantasy.
Yes, it's just like science.
Yeah, just like math. You know what's funny? While I was preparing for this topic and for our listeners, the reason we chose this topic, Becky is a longtime listener, a longtime friend, and we're both very into fantasy. To the point that, Becky, you're also very good friends with Hannah, my wife. Mm-hmm. And Hannah would always be a little bit upset when sometimes we would derail into fantasy talk.
But there was an easy solution. She just had to start reading fantasy, and then she could just join right in.
I don't understand this, and maybe you can answer me because I know you do this too. I'll start it with this. I know a lot of people say, "Hey, if you read a lot of books, you'll get smarter," and I can tell you that's not true because I only read fantasy books, and that'll make me any smarter.
It depends. It depends what kind of book you're reading.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, if you watch TV, you get dumber. It's like, no. If you only watch documentaries, I'm sure you're picking some stuff up. But for me, I only read fantasy. Like, that's all I read, nothing else. Now, I know you read nonfiction.
I do. I like to read books, either fantasy or books that have a very distinctive topic. Like, once I read a book that was just about rain, like just rain, or like trees. So that's the other kind of book I like to read.
Why?
It's really relaxing. So when you read fantasy, I don't know if this happens to you, but this happens to me. I get really, really into it. Like, I'll just read until the book is done. And so now that I'm sadly an adult with, like other obligations in life, I can't just stay up till 4:30 in the morning reading a fantasy book every night. Yeah. So sometimes you need a palate cleanser. You need a book that is not going to have you on the edge of your seat late into the evening, and a book about rain is perfect for that.
So my understanding is you purposely are reading boring books so you don't read that much.
They're not boring. It's just different. It's just different pacing. Yeah. So, but yeah, I have a really hard time putting fantasy books down once I start, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. Not Gimo, right, but other people.
One of the things that Becky is not saying, one thing that's very impressive is how fast you read. And I don't know if it's because you just glance or read every other sentence. I don't know how it works. But I've seen you read books, and I'm like, sometimes I think I tried it maybe once or twice with you, where it's like we kind of started at the same time for a book. We're like, oh, this is a good book, and I recommend it. You're like, oh, I'll take a read. And then you come back, and this happened with The Wheel of Time, where we say oh, let's read this book. So I started, and I'm in maybe halfway through book. I actually started before you, and I was either halfway through book 2 or 3. And then you're like, oh, I finished all 14 books. And I was like, what? So there's, in 2 weeks.
Well, to be totally fair, okay, I am a fast reader. But with Wheel of Time in particular, I was transitioning between jobs. And so I had about 3 weeks during which I was only working part-time. And so I basically, for my other half of my workday, just read Wheel of Time. So I had a little bit of an advantage.
Yes, it's sad because I'm still reading Wheel of Time. I'm not even done with it.
You're not done? Oh,
no, I'm such a slow reader, dude. You know what it is, and I'm not gonna try to spoil too many of these books, but spoiler alert, we're gonna probably spoil a couple of stuff. I'm basically right in the middle of the book series, right? And I did take a break and I read some books in between and then came back to it. But the reason I took a break was because I think it was book 7 or so. They started looking for that weather bowl.
Yep.
And man, that was a boring plot line, which we'll probably get to the books. I'll get to it in a little bit. But I guess let me rewind the clock a little bit. We kind of like it always goes. We start talking about fantasy, we derail immediately.
Yeah. So, Hannah knows.
Yeah, Hannah knows. So one of the reasons we chose fantasy has a topic for Under the Lid, and we're on our countdown now for like the last episode, which should be airing at the end of the year. So this one should be airing after episode 124. But one of the reasons we chose fantasy is because fantasy is one of those themes that it's used a lot in board games. So there's a lot of board games that are used theme, and we decided to make it a little more general. And this is kind of where I wanted your opinion, Becky, and maybe I just want to know what you think about this. So when I was looking at fantasy, I was like, all right, let's just talk about fantasy books. That's kind of what we agreed on, right? Just to discuss theming and then maybe eventually transition to board games by the end of the podcast, stuff that we want to see in games or stuff that would be more interesting. But I was starting to think of the medium of fantasy, because fantasy is just a genre, right? So you can have fantasy in books, movies, TV shows. I even have it on like a lot of manga, like the Japanese comic books have a lot of fantasy. So when you think of fantasy, do you look at other mediums or do you just look at books mainly?
I mean, I like to watch like fantasy TV and movies. I guess that's the other big one. Or do you mean more like board games and...
just in general. So like TVs and movies too, right?
Yes. I mean, definitely like I am down for a good like book adaptation into a film or like TV series. I also do get like sad when they're bad adaptations of books I really like, which is typical, I think, for most people that really like a book that they read and then they watch the show and it's not as special as the way they remember it. So I think I'm not alone in that point. In terms of like, okay, full caveat, something Gimo has not shared, is that I am the number one podcast fan who is not a serious board gamer. So, like, I'll play a board game, but I'm not, like, really into board games. So I know now, by listening to Gimo and Adam, like, a weird amount of board gaming knowledge, considering, like, I don't really play board games that hardcore. And so, like, one thing I know you guys talk about a lot is, like, is the theme of the board game important? And I guess we're going to maybe talk about that later. But I don't know for me whether that would, like, if I, like, say it was, like, Lord of the Rings, just to take, like, the most typical. If they make that into a board game, like, I don't think that would make me want to play the board game more, just because I like the book.
That's interesting. So you played... Skyrim, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Like Elder Scrolls Skyrim?
Yeah.
Did you play that game? And I know you had said that you don't like playing games like that because you get too hooked on it.
They're too addictive. Well, it's the same thing for me as reading the books. Like, I read forever until it's done. But you can't do that with, like, video games because they last hundreds of hours. So you have to live your life. And so it's very unsatisfying for me.
Yeah.
But
make sure you don't start gambling, dude.
I know. There's certain things about me that I know. And so, yeah, I don't think that I really enjoyed it when I played it. It was lots of fun, but it was also a unique period in my life. So
let me ask you this then, because you basically said, hey, if there's a Lord of the Rings game, which there's a lot of Lord of the Rings games, right, that are board games, you're like, that's not really what's gonna hook you, right? I played games with you, so I kind of know what some of the games that you like. Did Skyrim catch your interest at all because it was fantasy, or you was just kind of like, hey, I just picked it up?
Oh no, definitely.
It happened to be fantasy.
Because I think in Skyrim I did enjoy like the world building. I just am not sure in board games whether it's immersive enough that it really provokes that same response. But I did I think like I liked Skyrim because it was I mean, it's not Tolkien, but it's similar. It's high fantasy. So
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me follow up. Sorry, I'm asking you a lot of questions here, so I'm interrogating you.
That's
I want to
okay.
make sure the audience knows who they're talking to.
And
right?
I already outed myself. They've all turned it off anyway because they're like, oh, she doesn't even like board games.
Yeah. What is this podcast even about? No, this is the nothing episode, right? So we have episodes about everything and episodes about nothing.
Yeah.
So
It's not about nothing. It's a crossover topic. I'm hoping that out of your like whatever millions of fans that are out there
I think trillions, dude.
who listen to this, there are probably a fair number of people who enjoy board games and also like to read fantasy or watch fantasy on TV. So
yeah,
I
think that's definitely a big crossover, which is why I kind of like I wanted to have this episode, because it's such a big crossover because that theme is used all the time and people keep on buying into it. There's a lot of themes in board games that are like farming and like kind of boring, like Agricola, right? Like, oh, here's a farming game. It's like,
yep.
Great.
Or the game I played growing up that actually was called The Farming Game.
Oh, yeah. I forgot. Yeah. I did see that. I don't want to play that game, but
it's really long and repetitive, and there's almost no actual strategy to it. It's mostly just luck.
All right. But that farming theme, I never was like, wow, farming? Let me do that. But with fantasy, I'm always curious and most of the time disappointed. I kind of want to transition to why I'm disappointed. But before we move into that, I don't know if you got into play something like Dungeons and Dragons or a role-playing game, but a lot of those are usually based on a heavy fantasy world, usually inspired by Tolkien, right? Mm-hmm. So is that something that you would also want to try, or is that type of game is just not really interested, even if whether it's fantasy or not?
I might be willing to try it. I never have, but we have many friends who play Dungeons and Dragons, and so I'm kind of feeling like it's coming for me one way or the other.
There's no escape.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would. Probably that would be fun. I have no idea.
But I guess my question would be: are you interested? Does it sound more interesting because your friends are playing it, or because it could potentially have a really rich fantasy theme to it?
I have never found a board game where, no matter how good the theme was, it made me feel the same way reading a fantasy book did. But I know Dungeons and Dragons is like more immersive than some other games, so maybe that would be different.
Okay.
But I don't know.
All right. So with that in mind, one of the things I wanted to mention, and I wanted to get your opinion on, and sorry that if you want to bring up questions, feel free to bring them up, but I had like a list of things I was going to ask you.
I'll interrogate you later.
Okay, perfect. So one of the things that I have issues with is Tolkien. I actually love J.R.R. Tolkien. I love Lord of the Rings. I got it tattooed on my arm. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, but I think he kind of created modern fantasy, right? Modern, he created it in the 50s, but
right.
I think a lot of like I'm going to call them Western, because I do have some Eastern fantasy I wanted to discuss too, but Western fantasy books, England and US, very heavily copy stuff from Tolkien. So a lot of the time when I see either a book or I see a game or I see a movie, and they immediately start saying, here's the dwarves, here's the elves, like World of Warcraft, it immediately kind of, it almost like bothers me, because I was like, dude, do you really want to set yourself up to be compared to the Lord of the Rings?
I mean, it's tough because Tolkien was so fantastic that it's very hard for anybody to compete on that level. And if you want to have, so you probably know the backstory of Tolkien, but he was a linguist. And did you know that?
Yes, I did know that.
Yeah. So,
bro, who do you think you're talking to?
I'm just checking.
But for the peasants.
For the peasants out there who don't know, so the world building started as like almost an academic exercise. So you think of like the nerdiest professor who spent a lifetime on certain things. And so he built almost the world first and then the plot later. And so I think a lot of other fantasy writers feel the pressure from that example to do that dense world building that Tolkien did. And I don't think it's necessary. And in fact, they usually don't do a good enough job at it that it's worth the reader's time, in my opinion. So yeah, I think like he did it really well, but that doesn't mean that all fantasy needs to have like its own language written, like a complete linguistically appropriate language, plus like an entire historical 3,000 year backstory, plus you don't need that in order to enjoy the book.
And you know what's funny? The first thought when you said that was like Terry Pratchett, right? Terry Pratchett in Discworld, he specifically doesn't draw maps for Discworld because he doesn't want that setting. And Discworld, what is Discworld? Like 41 books, I think.
Yeah,
all of Discworld, and that's really rich in characters, but not background. Like if you read a book, it doesn't add rich history to the town of Ankh-Morpork or whatever it was called. Right. And, there's like series that are involving the same characters, which we can talk about that too. Again, I have a long list to talk about. So I don't know what the best way to tackle it is, if we talk one at a time or something. But
I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, I mean, I also am a huge Terry Pratchett fan. And I do love that his books are so different, like in tone and style from Tolkien, so that you don't feel like you're just reading a cheap knockoff of someone else's work. I mean, and it's a shame, I know he had, I think, Alzheimer's and died pretty recently, but he was great and very productive. Like, he wrote so many books. And granted, if you binge them a little bit, I think you start to get tired and need a break. Like, if you read 10 in a row really fast, like some people might have.
I was going to say, that's like a you problem. I don't think most people have that problem.
But I love his sense of humor. I love the characters. I mean, I think one of my favorite elements from Terry Pratchett was the guy who had the belief system that, like, as long as you had your potato, you would be all right. Do you remember this guy?
Wait, what was this one?
It was one of the ones. Honestly, I can't remember which book, but it was one where Death was one of the main characters, and there were some thieves, and like one of the thieves was like kind of the he was like dumb and sweet, but like also a criminal. And or maybe they were assassins, I don't remember, something bad, and the other one was like super evil. And and so the sweet bad guy, he like has this potato that he wears or carries, and they get into a spot where like they realize they're going to die, and the mean bad one asks the other one about the potato, and he's like, oh, like I don't really remember what the belief system is, but like it's something along the lines of, as long as I have my potato, I'll be all right. And so the last thing that the other guy does while he's alive is he steals the potato from the other guy. And then it turns out that if you have the potato, when you die, you turn into a potato.
Well, so you know what I like about Discworld and Terry Pratchett in general is, I think a lot of like fantasy novels take a very heroic stance with the main characters. Like, I immediately think of like Aragorn on like Lord of the Rings, right? Like, like stoic and like good at everything. And I feel like in Discworld it's kind of like the opposite, where he goes like, hey, here's like a regular dude in a really like fantasy situation, and they have to overcome that, right? And I don't know if you read Guards.
I did, but it's been a while. Yeah.
Right. So they in that one, they have like the police department is there, but they don't fight crime anymore because there was so much like, I don't remember exactly the plot, but I'm pretty sure it was something like there was so much like stealing going on that like the king set up its own guild for thieves.
Right.
They had a quota on how much to steal. So basically the guards had nothing to do but just sit around and get drunk.
Yeah.
And then they get challenged with like a real situation. I think it was like a dragon or something. And then the situation goes like, okay, how do these like drunk and like immoral people deal, like everyday humans deal with a dragon? And that's kind of what I like about Terry Pratchett, where a lot of the characters, such as you can relate to most characters, right?
Yeah.
When they say, oh, this guy has like a little beer belly, I'm like, dude, I get you.
Yeah, I think the first Terry Pratchett book I ever read was Going Postal, and it's the same thing. It's a guy who, have you read that one? Or
yes.
Yeah, and that one's pretty good. And it's about like kind of trying to restart a postal system that has completely collapsed, and like how would this random dude like manage to do it, and he has to like invent stamps or something. So yeah, or the stamps turn into money, or I don't know, it's complicated, but I love the characters, and I love how funny it is, just the whole idea of Discworld, held up on the 4 elephants on top of the turtle, like he's just great.
Right. Well, like that's why I liked it, because it's almost like a mimicry, not mimicry. Like a parody of Lord of the Rings, where it's like it doesn't take itself seriously. And I love, one of the things that I love and also hate, because one of the things that I've been doing lately, I have a longer commute, so I listen to a lot of audiobooks. But you can't really do that with Discworld because a lot of the jokes are in the footnotes. And if you listen to an audiobook, it goes into the footnote and then it kind of distracts you from what's actually happening. Which I love that style of comedy, but it's just I don't think it translates that well into like an audiobook.
Yeah, you have to read it kind of more immersively than in the car.
Yeah,
exactly. That brings up something interesting that I want to ask you about, which is how do you feel when, so I know Terry Pratchett did this with, I think, Stephen Baxter. Mm-hmm. How do you feel when two authors team up to write a book together? Or where a series gets taken over, like in the case of Robert Jordan's death, like gets taken over by someone else. Do you notice the change? Or like when you read, do you think like, oh, that part's Terry Pratchett, that part's Stephen Baxter? I think another one would be
Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett.
Good Omens. Yeah, Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett did as well. Good Omens. And I definitely noticed it because, okay, not a huge... I don't hate Neil Gaiman, but I'm probably not as big a fan as some other people are. And I love Terry Pratchett. And I felt like when I was reading it, there were these elements that were very Pratchett-like, where I was like, oh, this part's good. And then I'd get to like these ponderous, boring parts. And I'm like, that's Gaiman.
Yeah. So, but funny enough, we have the same opinion with Neil Gaiman. There's some, like, I think the books are okay. Like, I don't think they're bad. I read a lot of his books.
Yeah, like, I'll read them, but I don't love them.
Right. And one of the funniest thing is that's how I feel exactly about like Good Omens, where I read it and I'm like, oh, this is like the average of Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. So it's a little more serious than Terry Pratchett, but not as funny as Terry Pratchett. So it reads like a shittier Terry Pratchett book to me. Yeah. Like, I'm not saying it's bad. I liked it. I think there's the Amazon series. I didn't finish watching the Amazon series, but I did start it a little bit.
I actually thought the Amazon series was pretty good. It was very funny. So I feel like they did a decent job of that one. So I would recommend that. Yeah.
Okay, because, so I like Good Omens. And if Terry Pratchett didn't exist, I think Good Omens would be one of my favorite fantasy books. But because there's 41 books by Terry Pratchett, like, Good Omens is 42nd.
Yeah.
I wrote down some of the books that I read by Neil Gaiman, right? And Good Omens is one of them. And I almost felt like Good Omens was Terry Pratchett teaching Neil Gaiman how to write comedy, and then Neil Gaiman not picking any of it up for the remainder of his books. So...
Yeah, well, Neil Gaiman, like, I recently read an interview he gave in, I think it was in, like, New York Times, because he recently had what just came out that he did. Do you remember?
No, but he releases a lot of books, so...
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm thinking of. But anyway, so they had interviewed him, and he sounds, like, very, very smart, and, like, he thinks about things very hard. And I'm not saying that, like, that means that you necessarily write a really serious book, but he kind of sounds like a serious person, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even his more lighthearted books, like he has... Coraline, right? I don't know if you read it or you've seen the movie.
I think I have, Coraline. But it's been a very long time.
So that one's more dedicated to kids, but even then it's like a horror kids book, and it's kind of like a picture book.
Oh, it was it was the Sandman that just came out. That was Neil Gaiman's.
Yeah. Yep. That did just come out. So Coraline, I like it, but and I think it's very interesting. It's kind of what you said though, like he makes it like, oh, here's a more lighthearted book where like the main character is a young girl going into this like other world where there's like other versions of like her family and stuff, and they're all creepy, and it kind of works. It's not like it's lighthearted. I don't feel like it's like, oh, when Terry Pratchett writes like a kid's book, I'm thinking something like Mort.
Yeah,
Mort, right? You can feel like, oh, this is lighthearted. The jokes are a little bit lighter and more appealing to kids. With Neil Gaiman, I'm like, this is an interesting story for both adults and kids. And it's not necessarily more towards a kid. It's just kind of a straightforward one. And Neil Gaiman is, I think this is maybe the only one, or maybe there's another one. He wrote the book Stardust.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to talk about that.
Well, we can, because here's my opinion of Stardust. And I know this is going to sound terrible to everyone. I think the movie is better than the book.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I actually completely... We didn't even compare notes on this beforehand.
No. We're agreeing a lot in a lot of the authors right now.
This is why we're friends.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I totally agree. I saw Stardust first as a movie and then read the book. And I mean, I liked the movie. I wouldn't say it's like my favorite movie, but it was good.
Right,
it was very enjoyable. And then I read the book and I was like, is this it? It just didn't seem like enough somehow. So,
right.
Yeah.
Like the movie's so much more magical and it's so much more happy and lighthearted. And you read Stardust and you're like, okay, sure. okay.
It felt short too. Like the book, I know you're a slower reader than me, but I think you could agree. There's actually not that much material in Stardust, right?
Right.
So
it only took me like 7 months. So that's got to be quick, right?
Yeah.
Now, have you read? So I think Neil Gaiman's biggest hit is like American Gods. Have you read American Gods?
I have. I haven't seen the adaptation they made for TV, but I have read the book.
Okay. I haven't seen the adaptation either, because I guess me and Becky are like the same person. Apparently,
Yeah.
so.
I liked American Gods, the book. It wasn't my favorite, but I thought it was an interesting concept. So, you know, like the idea that most of the characters are in some way, whether by myth or whatever, like are gods because humans worship them in some way. So
yeah.
That's kind of interesting. It's a little like The Sandman, which I have to admit I have not read the source material. I've only now seen I think it's like Amazon Prime, the adaptation.
Yeah.
Did you?
That's also recent, yeah.
That just
so
came
I haven't
out.
seen it.
I liked it, but I don't have the, original book to compare it to. So I don't know. But it's sort of that same idea of like these anthropomorphized expressions of humanity. So like the Sandman or Morpheus is one of multiple different characters. Like, so one is death, and then there's others as well. Like I think there's like the devil and then a bunch of others.
Yeah, in American Gods, yeah, because I think Odin was one of the main ones. He was like Mr. Wednesday or something.
Yeah, because Odin is the father of the main character.
Shadow or whatever his name was, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I liked, and I guess the common theme I can see here with Neil Gaiman is that I like his concepts a lot. Like I said, like Coraline I really like. Even Stardust, I think it's like a cool, clever idea that the star falls and he has to give the star to his, like the ones he wants to marry. Good Omens is kind of funny. So I like the concepts. I guess I don't know if maybe I don't like his writing style.
That might be it. I think it's a little bit ponderous. And I also think that I don't mind reading a really serious fantasy book, but somehow his are not the right tone.
You know what it is? They almost read like just your standard novel. Because I'm so used to like the publisher like Tor, heavy fucking books where I'm like, which I don't necessarily, I guess, I feel like I don't like, but I guess maybe this is kind of what it's missing, where I'm like, oh, here's Tolkien describing how the fucking hobbits jumped over a rock.
So not enough world building. It's hard to please you, Gimo. Yeah. You either think there's too much or too little.
No, there's definitely some like writers out there, and we talked about the Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan being one of them, where I'm like, motherfucker, you can just move along. I don't need to hear how the rock looks, how the like leaves of grass and all. The blades of grass.
All right, we can let's talk about Wheel of Time. So
okay, let's get it out of the way.
I started reading Wheel of Time at your suggestion, Gimo. And I did read all of the books, but as I mentioned, I had an assist from my job situation at the time. And I clearly liked it enough because I was willing to read all 14 of them. Yeah. And there's a lot there. But on the other hand, I find them kind of frustrating. I think partly for the reason you mentioned earlier, that the pacing in some of the plot is really slow. Or just like not that interesting, and you kind of just get tired, you know?
Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of like a lull in a lot of the books.
Who knows though? Maybe when you were reading them kind of live, like he only came out with them every couple of years, so then perhaps you wouldn't be bothered by that as much because you wouldn't be binging them the way that I did.
Yeah, for me, what's funny is I think people love The Wheel of Time. And The Wheel of Time is one of the most beloved pieces of fantasy. I think Lord of the Rings is first. I'm thinking like Wheel of Time is second. Maybe Harry Potter. And then The Wheel of Time. Mm-hmm. But people love this book. And I was talking to my brother-in-law who also loves these books. And I started shitting on it. And I didn't shit on it because... So disclaimer, I like The Wheel of Time. That's why I've read 8 of the books of The Wheel of Time, because I like it. But... it has, I think, a lot of issues that, I mean, I have, obviously every book I read has issues, right? Like, if we go back to Lord of the Rings, I'm going to tell you this about Lord of the Rings. I remember when the movies came out, right? And, no, we rewatched the movies, and we had Hannah watch it with us, which was a terrible idea, because me and Becky were pausing, and it's like, did you see that? this is what the book is.
Poor Hannah. All right, like, let me give her a little credit. She had just started working as a nurse and was doing like crazy hours. And then we were making her watch like the extended cut Lord of the Rings. Didn't finish till like 12:30 at night. And then we'd be like, all right, Hannah, now we're going to quiz you on some characters that you learned about.
We were terrible. Terrible.
Because remember, we were like, she didn't remember who Gandalf was. And we were both just like really offended.
Yeah. I forgot that we were quizzing her. It was even worse than I remember. Poor Hannah.
It's amazing she's still willing to watch a movie with us.
So one of the funny things is we watch all of that, and I had read Lord of the Rings originally back in like around middle school and early high school. And so us rewatching them, and so basically I read it, watched the movies were coming out right around that same time, right? So I went to see the movies in theaters, and then we watched the movies again, and then I was like, oh, let me reread it again. And I had completely forgotten about Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
Like, and I still like the book more than the movie, but there were stuff in the books where I was like, thank fucking God they took out Tom Bombadil as a fucking character, because a lot of people love Tom Bombadil, but I'm like, dude, this guy, one, he talks in song, and like you spend like 5 chapters of him not being helpful at all, and then Tolkien building this like world around him. It's like, who is he? Is he so powerful and stuff? And it doesn't amount to anything. They literally go like, all right, see ya. Mm-hmm. And then like you never hear of him again until like I think the Council of Elrond, they're like, maybe Tom Bombadil can help. I was like, nah, he's not gonna help. And then that was it. It was just like a throwaway line.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because so full backstory. So my dad read The Hobbit to me when I was really little. So that was like my first introduction to Tolkien. And everyone knows that The Hobbit is kind of written for kids. Right. So recently, James and I have been rereading The Hobbit together, and it's been really fun. And we've been reading it out loud to each other.
Oh, cool.
Because we have this thing where like one person cooks dinner and the other person reads the book. And he actually is a good writer. And when you read it out loud, I think you appreciate the writing style. And for kids, I mean, The Hobbit is not a long book. The action goes really fast, you know, so I think it's like good book, right? And then you get into like The Lord of the Rings, which is, you know, way, way longer, not really written for kids. And just the density of the book, like you said, like it just focuses so much more on the world versus have you read The Hobbit recently or...
No. Semi-recently.
I mean, I think one funny thing about it, which I had forgotten, is he often will kind of allude to something and then be like, but that's not really like something we're going to talk about right now. So he kind of like keeps the action going by sort of saying like, oh, there's so much more in the background, but like we're not really going to focus on that. Versus what you're saying in Lord of the Rings, like the longer books where he kind of does, he just goes deep into... you know, the world and the characters, even when it doesn't really move the action forward. And I think that can be tough when you're used to reading fantasy. I mean, as a genre, I think fantasy in general is a very like plot-driven, action-driven style of writing, which is why, you know, younger, like kids really like it and often get into it early on. And then occasionally you'll read like a literary kind of fantasy book and it's weird, right? It feels weird because like tonally it doesn't fit with what we tend to think of. So I know like you gave me for like Christmas one year, The Name of the Wind.
I'm sorry about that.
I'm very mad at you still.
So my fault, didn't finish it. It was rated really high.
From now on, by the way, I have a policy. I don't start reading fantasy series, unless they have already finished them. Because for those who don't know, so The Name of the Wind came out. Do you remember what year the first one came out?
I don't know.
Maybe
it's been like a while now, though.
It's maybe 2012 or I don't know, even before that.
Yeah, around there.
So he started it, and it's great, and it's really well written. I mean, I think much better written than a lot of fantasy books are. And then he did come out with the second book, and I believe it was supposed to be like a 3-book trilogy, like your classic. But I finished the second book, and I just thought, there is no way he can finish this story in a third book, like in just one more book. And I'm wondering whether he thinks the same thing. I haven't checked. I haven't looked up recently what's going on, but it has been a while since that last book came out, and I've heard no indication that. And maybe I'm out of date. We should look that up and see whether like he's made any announcements. But
maybe you can get some closure.
I know. Well, and apparently like his fans, not me, I don't do this, but apparently some people have been harassing him like to finish the book. And I'm like, I don't think
sending him hate mail.
That seems pretty counterproductive to me, but
well, that's I guess we'd be shamed if we don't bring Game of Thrones up. Again, we're bouncing around so much, but so one, I don't like Game of Thrones. And you know what's hilarious? I was talking to my coworker. I'm talking to my coworker, and we're talking about fantasy. And then he goes like, he's a big fan of Tolkien too, right? And he goes like, people ask him, it's like, oh, you like Lord of the Rings, so you're gonna love Game of Thrones. He's like, no, I don't like Game of Thrones because I don't like Days of Our Lives, because it really is like almost like a soap opera. So I watched a little bit of the show, and I'm gonna say one good thing about Game of Thrones, and it's that there's no what's the term called? It's like character plot safety, where you're like, oh, this guy's the main character, so he's okay, he's gonna be okay until the very last book. It's like, no, that's not the case.
Right.
Like literally, they can just die, and that's really cool. I think that's a really clever way to write the book. But then, I don't want to read it for the same reason that you, the Name of the Wind is a no for me, because I know he's not gonna finish. His last book he released was more than 10 years ago. The guy made his money. He's not interested in writing it. People are like, oh, any day now. It's like, yeah, dude, any day for the last like 10, 15 years. I'm not interested in watching it. I'm not interested in reading it. And I don't think he's going to finish it. And the reason I don't want to watch it is because it does seem a little bit too much like a soap opera. Or it almost feels like Lord of the Rings with more incest and more fucking like boobs and dicks.
Yeah, I mean, I never watched the show. It's on HBO, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is just like I don't have HBO. Like maybe I would have tried it if I did. But I also tried to read the first book, and I actually abandoned it. I didn't finish it. Wow. And I think it was just I was reading it and I didn't. I think part of what I like about fantasy is that somebody is fighting for some kind of principle. And that's one of the things that makes it good, is that you have something to like root for and believe in. And in that case, pretty much everyone, in my opinion, sucks. or they're a victim and they die right away. I mean, so it just is depressing. And I'm like, well, why would I want to spend my valuable free time with these people? So yeah, that's kind of my thought.
Right, we shit on Game of Thrones. I shit on Lord of the Rings. So I just want people to know that I'm not just being very, I find issues in a lot of things. I'm gonna wrap up Lord of the Rings by saying I also didn't like. I watched the movies with you and Hannah, and then when I went back to read it, I had forgotten a lot of it because there was such a long gap where I read the books, watched the movies again like 2 more times, and then read the book. That had some plot lines I forgot, and I was like, do you remember that Saruman was killed at the end of the book? I had completely forgotten that he wasn't killed in the Two Towers.
I need to.
He was killed at the Hobbit.
I really should reread because I have not actually read the book since I was a teenager. So that has unfortunately a while ago at this point, and I would love to. I think maybe once we're done with the Hobbit, maybe we'll just move on to the Lord of the Rings. But it's an effort. You have to. That's a little bit more of a commitment to reread those. I do remember a very eager 6th grade version of me who binged the entire Lord of the Rings books the first time I read them, but I don't know if I would do that now. I might try and take my time with it a little bit more.
I think I remember you finding your diary and rereading yourself reading the Silmarillion and saying how you actually liked it.
I was a nerd. I still am a nerd, but I was definitely a nerd then.
Yeah. So that brings me back to the Wheel of Time, which the only reason I went back to Lord of the Rings is to say that I'm trying to be a little more objective here. One of the things I don't like about the Wheel of Time is, one, the first few books felt like the same, like the first 4 books literally had the same plotline where like, here's Rand, he needs to fight the big bad guy at the end of the book. He fights it, he beats it. Turns out he's not the real main bad guy.
Yeah.
Then you go to the second book, and it's kind of repetitive. It kind of stopped doing that by book like 5 and 6.
I mean, that's sort of how I feel Harry Potter is, just to bring up another of the big, fantasy series of our time. Same thing, right? Like, basically, he defeats some aspect of Voldemort on schedule at the end of the school year every year, and then he takes a summer break. So...
Okay, so let me ask you, since we're bringing Harry Potter, it's on the list. Everyone loves Harry Potter. What's your opinion on Harry Potter?
I definitely was a Harry Potter fan growing up. I had the great, I think, benefit of being about the same age as Harry. So, every year when a new book would come out, he would be the same age, or, I can't remember, we might be 1 or 2 years off, but about the same age. So, I think that's what I was saying about the Robert Jordan books, too. When you read the books and the character is growing up in order of time and you're the same age, I think it's very cool. And so it may be that there's this weird generation of millennials who will forever be devoted to Harry Potter because it was part of our growing up process. That said, do I think that they are strong plot wise? Some are better than others. Well, I think would be my answer. I think part of what I like about Harry Potter and what a lot of people like about Harry Potter is not so much the plot, but more the world, right? Because it's that cozy English boarding school kind of thing, where they live in this castle, and they all have beds that have four-poster beds with curtains on them and a fireplace in their room.
Are you describing your college years right now?
Unfortunately, it turns out college is not like that, no matter where you go. But yeah, so I think a lot of people really fell in love with the idea of that. And so that's successful world building, I would say, that people like that so much. And as you probably know a few people like this, I know people who are, we're now in our 30s and still living that Harry Potter life. So it made an impression.
For me, I have a love and hate relationship of Harry Potter. I'll start with my love. My love for Harry Potter is the way that J.K. Rowling wrote it. So we talked about Neil Gaiman's writing was kind of I don't want to say dull, but, kind of borderline that. Was just okay, I get it. And then Robert Jordan kind of writes I think a little bit in detail and kind of, I think sometimes he goes too far into an idea and then forgets to back out of it or just resolve it. And Tolkien, again, is very descriptive. I think J.K. Rowling, for me, she moves the whole plot along with dialogue. So for me, it's actually not a surprise that she went into screenwriting, especially for the new Harry Potter movies that are coming out. Because I think it was the natural next step, because if you read her books, they're basically just almost all dialogue. And it makes the story progress so fast because you're either only on Harry Potter's head or you're talking to the characters around them. Mm-hmm. So I love that writing because, one, it makes the books, I'm a slow reader, so it makes them read a lot faster and they still get a lot of the point across. And then you get so much more rich character interaction. The thing that I don't like is that for me, I think that's a really shittily made fantasy world. I'm a sucker for a good fantasy world. I love the idea of the Wheel of Time where the magic is separated into men and women, and then the man is tainted, so if you use it, you go crazy. I love that shit like that. So that's what I love. It's the character attraction stuff. But then the fantasy world is, I don't know, it doesn't make sense. There's no rules. I don't mind what's it called? Loose fantasy or whatever they call it.
Well, there's I think it's high and low fantasy. Yeah. So high fantasy is like Tolkien, a completely separate world. There's elves and dragons and magic everywhere. And then low fantasy would be more like The Magicians, which is another thing we could talk about. Or Harry Potter, where it's kind of set in a recognizable world, like the one that we live in, but then there just happens to be some magical element to it. So is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah. Well, yeah. You know what it creates? The issue that I have with it is the magic world doesn't make sense. It's why are wizards not they're oh, we have magic so we can have really inconvenienced things.
I mean, one of the things I love about it is that like pretty much almost everything that they can do with their wand, you can now do with like a smartphone.
Yeah. For me, you know what it felt like? I was like, oh, there's Voldemort and like the Death Eater. So I was like, nobody thought of like just bringing a gun? Like, how fast can he talk when you can just pull a trigger, right? It's just like, that's one of the issues that you run when you run into like a wizard world that's like takes place in the real world, where you're like, why didn't they do this, right? In Harry Potter, they had the Department of Human Studies, and I'm like, wait. More than half your population is humans. Why do you need a department to study them? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So that's my issue with Harry Potter. I think it's a really bad fantasy world. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I get people like it for like, oh, look, it's the wand having an owl and, like whatever. But for me, it was like, I get it. She took a lot of ideas from Halloween stores and then implemented it into the magical world. But it doesn't read like a good fantasy book to me. It doesn't read like, oh, the Wheel of Time. Here, let me immerse myself into this world that's really well thought out, that like, there's a hierarchy of like characters. I don't know. That's my issue with Harry Potter. I love the writing. I wish more books were written that way. And not there for the fantasy. Yeah, the book, I also didn't like the movies. I loved the books, by the way, because I was kind of like same age as Harry growing up. I would love the books. The movies, I was like, yeah, whatever. I guess I'll watch it, but it never felt as good as the book.
Yeah, I think the movies were always like fine, but I don't think they really captured the fun of the books as well. Mm-hmm. So, did you read or watch The Magicians?
No, I started watching it.
Okay,
I thought that was
it.
What's funny is until just literally now, I thought that wasn't that was a like actual original series, not based on a book.
Oh, yeah, it is. It's based on a book. I believe the author's name is Lev Grossman. Maybe could look that up. We can substitute that in if I'm wrong.
Sure.
But
I'm gonna keep it in there. Whatever.
And it's funny because The Magicians is I came into it by watching the TV series first and then read the books. Mm-hmm. And the tone, I guess we don't talk about too much if you haven't read them, but I think the tone of them is quite different between the book and the show. But yeah.
You mean what?
Well, I think they aged the characters up a little bit for the show. So they're a little bit older and they're very sad. A lot of the theme of The Magicians. So The Magicians, if you don't know, is set in like a human world, like Harry Potter. So it's got some parallels there. But they're older. I believe they're out of college, so they're like young adults. And they have magic, and there's like, the big bad guy they're trying to defeat. But the main theme of that like series is like how magic is pain, and how being a good magician, like basically like your pain fuels your magical ability.
Oh boy.
So it's a little bit, it's pretty emo. And then the main character, so one other funny point, well, interesting point, I think, is how many books they focus on like the singular hero. So like Aragon would be an example of this, like classic, usually like young boy, young man discovers something within himself, or like some circumstance occurs to him that marks him as special, right? And then he has to go out, and like in the end there will be a confrontation between him and the singular evil of the series, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, okay, I'll spoil it a little bit and just say that we kind of have a setup where there's a singular hero, particularly in the book, although in the show they try and like make it a little bit more of an ensemble thing. And the hero ends up like basically not really being that like amazing. So he's able to like do some things, but like he's not actually that great at like magic. Like he's not particularly powerful or good, so he's a little more average, I guess you could say, which is, I guess, turning the idea of the hero on its head a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, that happened with Harry Potter, where like the whole book, she shows how Harry Potter's not actually that strong, but sometimes he's strong. It just felt like he was just lucky a lot of the book, which I didn't really like. Now, you brought up, I think you said Aragon, or you said Aragorn.
Yeah, Aragon with an E.
So we can talk about Aragon. That's Christopher Paolini?
Yeah. Paolini, I think.
You know what I didn't I remember, and I think we talked about this book specifically because I read it when I was young. Again, same age as Aragorn when he was growing up.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I picked it up in high school. Yep.
Yeah, and he was around that age, so I was like, oh, I love this. I jumped to Aragorn, then Eldest came out, and I was like, ooh, this is pretty. Well, apart from the half with like his cousin, I was like, this other half is really good. And then like he took a little longer to release the next book, and then it was supposed to be a trilogy, and then it ends up being 4 books like it always is.
Yeah.
Like, oh shit, can't fit it all in one. And I never read those, so then I was like, I want to say like a couple of years ago, maybe like 4 years ago, I was like, you know what, I never finished that series, so I go back and I reread all the books. And I end up reading Brissinger and Inheritance as well, the new ones. And
I'm gonna predict what you're gonna say.
Okay, what is it?
They weren't as good as you remembered.
No. they were pretty bad, actually. Like Harry Potter, if I reread Harry Potter, which is also aimed for kids, it's still like decent. Like I still
it holds
enjoy
up.
it.
I think it holds up. Yeah.
Same thing with like Terry Pratchett. If I read, like I said, Mort, right? I reread Mort recently, and that was also, it's for kids, but also holds up.
Right, or like the Hobbit. I just reread.
The Hobbit,
still like it.
Yeah.
I
don't know if you ever read like Howl's Moving Castle.
Yeah, you recommended it to me. I read it recently, actually.
Yeah, so that one's also for like younger, and again, it holds up. This one did not. And if I remember correctly, so these are really dense books, by the way. Especially, I think he was 15 when he was writing them. He was literally our age when he was writing these books.
Which just makes you feel inadequate, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It makes me feel like I should be writing books. But I mean, granted, I think both of his parents are writers, so I'm sure he got some help or like naturally born abilities. So I remember the books being good. I reread them, and then I start noticing, like, I guess what I would say, what a 15-year-old thinks the plot would be, right? And the most like perfect example is the cousin in the book. I want to say they call him like Stronghammer or something. He had a relationship with this girl, and I forgot it. That was one of the subplot lines. He was trying to rescue this girl, and then the way every time they interacted. They were supposed to be older, so they were supposed to be married. But when they interacted together, he was trying to make him... The writing was what a 15-year-old thinks the parents talk about in private. That's how I read it. I was like, this is really cringy because it's not...
That's interesting.
Yeah, I was like, that's not how people, like, whether in love or people that age behave when they're, like, a couple.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I noticed, too... And they do this in Lord of the Rings. I think Lord of the Rings kind of started this trend of saying, like, instead of calling someone by name, they have some sort of title, right? And same thing, like, in The Wheel of Time, Rand is the Dragon Reborn. That's his title, right? And I forgot what Perrin's name is, but they all have, like, a title. Well, I don't know if you remember this, but Aragorn had, like, 7 or 8 titles throughout all the books. He was like, oh, he's the Shade Slayer. He's the Dragon Rider. He's this, he's that.
It's been a while since I've actually read those books, but I think so. I remember reading Aragon when it came out, so I was a teenager, and also it made me feel inadequate then that it was written by someone like basically my age. But I did enjoy it at the time, and then by the time the final book, was it Brissinger was the final one, or
no, it's Inheritance.
Inheritance came out.
Yeah.
I was like a full-on adult by that point.
Yeah.
And I remember I read it and I kind of was like, maybe I should go back and reread the original book. But then I was like, I'll just get through it and see how it goes. And it turned out even by then, I was sort of not super impressed anymore. And I think one issue, I think that's a good point what you bring up about just not having a lot of life experience yet. You don't have to be old to write well, but being 15 and trying to write a married couple, I could see being very hard. But just some of the other elements of that book, I think it's too derivative. Like it's almost a little bit like fan fiction. Like it contains all the elements, but they just and it reads well. Of another famous, I believe, book that started as fan fiction was, do you know which one I'm going to say?
50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, and so it's not like those can never become like a book that comes out that people want to read. Like clearly there's a market for that, and it's but I kind of think of it like candy. Like it tastes good going down, but after you've eaten a lot of it, you start to feel kind of sick.
Yeah.
So
that's one of the points I kind of wanted to make earlier, where I said like Tolkien created fantasy. So every time there's a fantasy book that I immediately see, oh, there's elves and dwarves, I'm completely like, all right, is that really what you want to write about? Because if you read The Wheel of Time, or you even Harry Potter, they're fantasy, but they're not based on the generic fantasy world that Tolkien created. Like Dungeons and Dragons was literally based on the Tolkien characters. And that's what Aragorn was like, look, there's dragons, and then there's elves, and then there's dwarves and orcs. And I'm like, dude, you serious right now? Are you going to come up with your own idea at some point? Or are we going to just read through am I going to read through a shittier Lord of the Rings? And what I think it was more evident, I don't know, words. I don't learn them from fantasy books. I don't use complex language. It was pretty evident to me when he started writing about the elves. So in Lord of the Rings, the elves are this like majestic race. And there's a reason for that. There's a whole backstory on why the elves behave the way that they are.
Right.
And it's also one of the plot lines that, hey, the elves are so attuned with nature and they're immortal that they don't really care too much what happens with the world, which is why it's so hard for help to get them to help out, right? It has to literally be end of the world stuff for them to help out. And that's a plot line in Lord of the Rings. And it's also a plot line where, hey, the humans are, very, like, because they have more, like, they were gifted mortality, which is kind of fucked up, but that's how in the Silmarillion it's like, hey, the humans were gifted mortality, which is why they're so good at building structures and progressing through time when like the dwarves and the elves are set on their ways. Mm-hmm. Now, Aragorn was like, okay, here's elves. They're also majestic, immortal, and like better at everything than human. Sorry, Aragorn, yeah. A Lord of the Rings in my head. And anyway, he wrote all that stuff, and I'm like, all right, but in your world, it doesn't make sense. Like, why are the elves majestic in your world? Why even have dwarves if they don't literally add nothing to the story? Yeah. So, big rant about.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a little weak when you read it with a more critical eye. That said, like, it sold very well. People liked it. I mean, I read it and I liked it at the time. So I don't want to like be too harsh on it, because part of the fun of fantasy is just having fun reading it. You don't have to like, it's not like literary criticism where you need to like really delve deeply every time. But if you read enough fantasy, I think you do start to get tired of reading books that aren't that well written. I don't know if you feel this way or not. I think when I was younger, I was much less critical and much less picky. I would just read whatever. If it had a unicorn in it, I would read it, But like now I'm a little bit more like, I think just getting older, you start to see through things a little bit more and see where writers are being lazy or where it's boring. Like you were saying, even in Tolkien, like sometimes it just gets boring. Like you don't want to read 5 chapters about a minor character's like something or other. So I think like you start to like know your taste a little bit more and what you like, and also you can recognize like who is really great, like Terry Pratchett.
So talking about poorly written books, did you ever read Percy Jackson and the Olympians by
No, I never did. I've heard of it, but I haven't read that. Okay,
then I'm gonna just glance through it. I read it. It was the writing. I mean, it's a young teen book, right? So it's like kind of like Aragorn. I think it's written a little better than Aragorn, but it's still kind of like. It's funny because I usually don't like books that are kind of read a little bit harder, like like the Lord of the Rings or something. But this one like read too easy, where I was like, there should be a little more description. There really is no pleasing me.
No, and you know how you can really notice if a book is not that well written is if you read it aloud. So like I said, James and I sometimes read aloud to each other. And I read, do you know the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, I think it's called?
Yeah.
So I was reading one of those books with him. It was actually during like the pandemic when we had nothing else to do. And I really noticed how weak the writing was when I was reading it aloud. Because when you are reading it to yourself, like at least for me, like because I read fast, like I can kind of just like go with the story. I don't think too much about the writing. But when you read it aloud, you have to slow down and you're really like paying attention. And I just realized how like, oh my gosh, like I just read like for 40 minutes or whatever. And like, I feel like I got nothing out of it. And I think when it's well written, that doesn't happen. I think then you actually appreciate how nicely it's written. I'm not advocating to read books aloud. I'm just saying it is one way that you can notice this. Maybe when you're listening to audiobooks, you'll notice it too. I don't know.
I was talking to a couple of friends where I was like, dude, I literally read with my finger pointing at the word the way I never am.
Well, it's a good thing you became an engineer instead.
Yes, exactly. We're talking about like kind of like a younger books for like a younger audience. We mentioned Howl's Moving Castle. This is one where I hate. People love the movie. I don't know if you ever seen the animated movie.
I haven't.
Okay, well, I'll say don't. I guess maybe do. A lot of people love it. It actually kind of feels like the Aragon movie. Did you see the Aragon movie?
No.
Well, it felt like the director read the first 2 chapters and he's like, "Oh, I got the gist," and then finishes it up himself. So that's like Howl's Moving Castle. So this is Diane Jones. This is actually a 3-book series, but the last. It's kind of a weird trilogy because the second and third book have, I think it's Sophie and Howl are the main characters, but they're like side characters. They're not the main character, and they're only like in part of the book. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on this? This one's one of my favorite, I guess, young teen books, just because I love the pace of it, and there's stuff in it that caught me off guard, like right, Sophie being like an enchantress and making herself be old, kind of thing. Like I wasn't expecting that. So what's your thoughts on this one now that you read it?
You know, I read it and I remember enjoying it. And I read it reasonably recently too, so I have no excuse for like not really remembering the plot that well anymore.
She gets turned into an old lady and then rescued by this charming wizard. That's an asshole.
Right. I kind of remember that. Yeah, I mean, I think I liked it. It clearly didn't make a huge impression, like as big an impression on me as it did on you, because like I'm like struggling to even really remember the plot. But I don't remember like being like, oh, this is badly written. Like,
yeah, you know what's funny? So when I recommended Howl's Moving Castle, you recommended me The Bear and
and the Nightingale.
And that book was hard to read, not because it was like the paragraphs itself were easy, but like every name was in like Russian because it takes place in Russia.
Yeah.
And,
I really love.
I hated you for that. I couldn't keep track of the characters. I read half. It's more than half because it's really short. Yeah. But I stopped and I haven't gone back to it. But it was like I'm like, oh, this is gonna be the main character, and then it wasn't the main character. It was a different character. I was like, okay, whatever. And then I'm trying to remember the names, and I can't because I don't know Russian, and I'm not really like I don't really know that many Russian people. All the names like kind of like blend together, so it always took me forever to be like, shit, who was this person again? Like,
yeah, I got you. Yeah, I mean, I didn't anticipate that being a thing, but I can see how that would be. And I do think like the cool thing about that book, and I've read 1 or 2 other fantasy books that kind of incorporate this, is like, and actually other fantasy books do this, but not for Russia. They do it for other countries or cultures. Mm-hmm. But incorporating myth or like fairy tales into the story is something I really like. And so I think that's one reason I like that book, because it kind of is about the dark Russian woods of the past and, you know, the old witch and the spirit of winter and things like that. And I actually think that's really cool when it's done well. So that's definitely something I like.
Yeah, I'm actually, at some point, I wanted to talk very briefly about Eastern fantasy, which is more like manga and anime and stuff. Mm-hmm. But one of them, one of the most famous animes, I think, of all time is called Dragon Ball, right? And that's Akira Toriyama, which I also consider fantasy because they have like, they don't call it magic, but they have this other thing called ki. Actually, they do have magic in there too. But that story is originally based on Chinese mythos. Like there's like a monkey boy with a flying cloud and a stick that extends, and then that's the main character of Dragon Ball. FYI.
Okay,
so
I haven't. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that one. The only manga I've read was the one you lent to me, The Alchemist.
Oh yeah, Full Metal Alchemist. What's your opinion? Well, I guess we can talk about it really quickly. That was okay. Hold on, I wrote it down. Hiromu Arakawa. That's the author.
I liked it a lot, but at the same time, I was frustrated by it because it's not a medium that I'm used to. Reading I never really grew up reading like comics or anything like that. Like I didn't read comic books.
Yeah.
I didn't read manga. So that was the actual first one I'd ever read, and I think what I enjoyed it. And the story was cool. I had fun with it. And actually, I've been watching this show called, I think it's Lock and Key. Have you seen this one? Which I think is based on a manga as well. But anyway, and so I think what I didn't like, this sounds bad, is I'm such a fast reader.
Yeah, I remember this. I gave you like 10 books, and then you come back like an hour later. You're like, what? This is it? I was like, no, there's just more. I wasn't expecting to read them that quick.
Yeah, so I guess like you're supposed to look at the pictures more.
The art is so good too.
But I just felt like I was like flipping the pages really fast, and I don't know. So I think I would have to like really slow down and like get into it. And I did. I liked it a lot, actually. I thought it was really cool, and I'm glad that you convinced me to read it. And I would be willing to like try again. But that was like I was a little frustrated by it at the same time.
So I'll mention one more, like two more mangas just to get, but then I kind of want to quickly shift to magic systems. So because, we've been talking, again, we always get derailed when we talk about fantasy, but I also kind of wanted to get to a point where we talk about some of our favorite authors, favorite books, and favorite magic systems. But just so we get it out, one manga I would maybe recommend to you is called One Piece, and it's Eiichiro Oda. And it's about pirates, but it's like a fantasy pirates. Like they have magic powers, and it's a really long one, so you would like it because it will take you all of like maybe a day and a half to read, as opposed to the 30 minutes. And I have all of it, so if you're ever around here, you'll probably read them in less than a week, and I can let you borrow it. So One Piece One Piece actually is the most sold comic book, I think, of all time. And in fact, that right now, last year, it outsold every other comic book, like itself, sold more than combined other comic books. That's how much it sold. So it's a pretty good one. There's also I don't know if you heard of like Naruto. That's also like in kind of what I'm getting at with this. Naruto's like about ninjas, so they instead of magic they use ninjutsu, so like ninja arts. But one of the things that I like about Eastern fantasy, it's kind of what you were saying, and kind of what we mentioned a little bit, especially with Aragorn's problem, which is a copy and paste of Tolkien, right? They just go like, oh, this is how fantasy should be, so let me write a book in a slightly different world, right? And that's kind of like Game of Thrones. It's like, people like dragons, let me put a dragon in here. But what I noticed is manga's fantasy is usually very unique, and kind of like we saw it with Full Metal Alchemist. Their whole magic system is they transmute, which I thought was so cool. They're like, okay, here I have these resources, and I can transmute them into something else, like convert them into something else. And the whole plot line is that it's like two kids that lost their mom, and they tried to convert her back to life, and then they end up like losing a lot because of it, because you're not supposed to do that.
Right.
So with that in mind, right now, I think maybe Full Metal Alchemist is probably my favorite magic system, followed by like the Wheel of Time. So like, what do you have any like magic system that you thought like, oh, this is super cool, or anything like that?
Well, it's funny you bring up the Wheel of Time, because I'm not sure how I feel about that magic system. I don't know if I like it or not. I think like for one thing, and I know Robert Jordan has gotten a lot of flack for the gender kind of elements of it, which is interesting. So for those who like haven't either read or watched the series, the idea of the magic in the Wheel of Time is that both men and women can do magic, but they access different aspects of the magic. So the source from which they derive their magic is separate. And it's funny because, I've read like some pieces online about what people think about this, and people tend to think that Robert Jordan's books are sexist. But like some people think they're sexist against men, and some people think they're sexist against women. So I don't know if I like that whole concept that much because well, I don't know. I have some complicated thoughts about like gender in that particular series, which I think it has to come up because of the way that he designed magic. So like I would say in general, the classic fantasy book is focused on one guy. Like that would be the classic thing. Or like
Right.
in the case of Tolkien, it might be focused on kind of like a group of like the Fellowship, right?
That book is sexist. There's no women in that book. There's literally Eowyn and Arwen.
Yeah. And like, a couple of side characters. But one thing about Robert Jordan, like he does write a lot of women into the series, which is, cool, like definitely different from Tolkien. But sometimes like the way that he writes his characters is like kind of repetitive. Like
Oh,
it's like
boy.
he
Here we go.
just
I'm
had
ready.
like too many characters. And so like if you've ever noticed, like you should pay attention since you're still reading these, how many of the innkeepers do something called dry washing their hands. Like he uses this phrase like every time, and they go to a lot of inns and like or taverns or pubs, because they're traveling all the time, and then they'll meet the innkeeper who is, quote, dry washing his hands. And it like, A, what does that mean? What is dry washing your hands? And B, like it's so noticeable because it's a weird phrase, and then you notice like every innkeeper does it.
Dude.
So I think like just back to my original point, which is like, I love reading books. I don't care whether they're about, like, I'm not like, oh, there's no women in this, I won't read it, right? Like, I'll read books that are just about men. Like, I'm not going to be offended. But I do think, like, Robert Jordan made a deliberate attempt to have more women in the series, but it's a little dated kind of the way he describes it sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, so I'm gonna tell you, this is hilarious. Because you're right. Because of the way he wrote it, it brings up this topic a lot. And like I told you, I was talking to my brother-in-law. We basically start talking about this, and I start complaining about the way Robert Jordan writes women and how I don't like it. And I'll tell you why. And maybe you can give me your opinion or not, if I'm right or wrong. And everyone's gonna hate me for this, but I really like the way he wrote most girls and women at the beginning of the books. And then there's in this world, like we said, really the only people that are supposed to and really can do magic is women. So there's this whole group of women, which are, they're like the wizards of the world, and they're called like Aes Sedai, right? And they're all very pompous and annoying and jerks. But it makes sense because they think they're like above everyone because they can do magic, right? So that I can get them, that's why they're pompous. And then they introduce these other characters that have like very unique personalities. But then eventually these women, and then they all turn into Aes Sedai because they can do magic. But then they all start becoming jerks. And like, and maybe that's not true, but that's how I'm reading it. I was like, I loved Egwene and I loved Elaine and Nynaeve. Nynaeve is probably one of my least favorite characters, but I loved those two at the beginning of the books. And then like, as they get more and more well versed in magic, they start becoming kind of like those people that they follow, which kind of makes sense, right? They become Aes Sedai, but then they start becoming jerks, and I'm like, dude, a lot of this is like, oh well, we're not gonna talk to the main character. Why? And then that's just like a plot hole where like I was like, there's like very little communication in this world where I'm like, you guys can just talk about this plan, and then there would be no like. But
then they wouldn't need like 3 extra books just to like get a letter from one part to another.
Yeah, but the FYI for anyone that wonders who my least favorite character is, Perrin, because Perrin, I
love Perrin.
No, Perrin sucks, dude.
I think Perrin's the best.
Perrin literally all he does is whine about how the wolves want to help him out.
Well, okay, they all have problems, but anyway, I think like you should stick with it because after Robert Jordan died, the last 3 books got written by somebody else, and I actually, don't at me, people, but like they're better, like they're written better, and they're like they have a more like modern. I think they're a little bit more modern in the way that they're written, and they're a little bit more tight. Like the plotting and just like the pacing is a little bit more tight, and I think they're good. So if you can stick through, you're almost there. What are you on, like book 8?
Yeah.
So you're almost
8 or 9,
there.
whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you actually read Brandon Sanderson, like other books by him?
No.
Okay, so he did the Mistborn and the Stormlight Archives.
Okay.
So if you're looking for your next book, read the Mistborn series.
I should check it out.
Yeah, because that's the writer, right? So he wrote the Mistborn series first, and that's why they chose him to write the ending of the Wheel of Time. So the Mistborn, I think, is 6 books. I think it's 2 trilogies. It's like basically like 2-part trilogies that take place in the same world. And I think the Stormlight Archives, I haven't read them yet, but they take place, I think, in the same universe.
Yeah, I thought my impression of him from his work, I mean, obviously when he's writing his own stuff, I'm sure it's a little bit different because he's constrained in by trying to finish what Robert Jordan started. But I thought his writing was pretty good. I don't know what other people thought, but I actually thought the series ended pretty well. I was happy with the ending when it finally came.
So you know what's interesting? So you had asked me what I think about a writer picking up the work. Well, we basically talked about Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, and we got sidetracked. So there's this manga series that's also fantasy. It's called Berserk, but this is like really dark fantasy, and I'm not a huge fan of dark fantasy when it gets like really grim and gory and really sad. I like the more upbeat stuff. So this one also, the writer died, and what they're doing is they hired his best friend. So he literally had like a best friend that he would bounce ideas from. And what the friend is doing is he said, hey, I won't finish the manga. I'll just write whatever he told me he was going to put in there. So he's not going to add any extra chapters, any flavor. He's just literally going to say, here's what he told me he was going to put in the manga. Let's add that in. Whether it has an ending or not, it doesn't matter. He's just going to add the volumes that he knew they were coming up. So it's just an interesting take because I prefer that they do finish it. Like, I understand, like, if the author dies, it kind of sucks. I feel like they should try to, right? And that's what Robert Jordan did because they planned it ahead and they knew they were going to, he, like, basically wrote out the plot. And then Sanderson just kind of came in, fill in all the blanks and was able to finish it. And I actually prefer that than just leaving something unfinished. And that's what I would say to, like, the Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. I was like, dude, just hire a ghostwriter. Right? Like, if you can't finish it, he's old now. He's in his 70s, right? I was like, you're not going to finish it. It's fine. Literally hire a ghostwriter and have him finish it for you. Like, literally be like, you know what? Try to figure it out, finish it, and I'll give you the rights for it. Just for the last few books.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I'm not very invested in the outcome on that one, but I think if I were a fan of a series that I'd been following for a long time and then the ending was just kind of some notes, I would feel pretty disappointed. So if it was just like, here's what was going to happen. Because one thing I don't like fan fiction alternative writing of stuff. Like, I think there should just be one version that's written by the author, and that's like the real version. And so, like, all this stuff, okay, people will probably be mad if I say this, but like all of that other stuff of like, but what if, like, this happened, or like these two characters got together, or like I'm gonna make a side adventure of this other thing. I'm like, no. That's not yours. And it's different. It's different with Robert Jordan because like he planned it out with like one trusted person who he knew would respect like his vision and gave him like the notes, and then they were able to write it according to what he wanted. So there's still one official version. But I think if you just gave people notes, it's just an invitation to like all these alternative endings. And maybe this is just like I'm too like much of a linear thinker. Like, I just want to have like one story. I don't want to have like a million different alternative stories.
So that's funny. I'm gonna stop writing fan fiction about Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry.
No, I mean,
I'll take it down right now.
Feel free. I just am not gonna read it.
I'm gonna send it to James so he can read it out loud to you. One book we haven't mentioned, and I think we're both fans of it. It's the Old Kingdom series by Garth Nix. That's Sabriel, Lyriel, and a Porson.
I'm pretty sure that the reason we became friends, because I was friends with Gimo's wife Hannah first, and then she introduced me to this like strange man that she was dating, and I went over to your apartment at one point, and then I looked at your bookshelf, and I was like, oh, he has Garth Nix on there, so like we have something that we can talk about. So that was how we became friends.
And then Hannah was like, stop talking about it.
She's welcome to read them too. I've never seen her have any interest in it.
Hannah's very interesting. She reads a lot of like nonfiction, and when I mean nonfiction, it's not like a biography. Like, she likes to just read like sections of certain books that are like almost like in bulleted form. It's like, oh, I only need to read this 3 chapters of this book, and I'm like, okay, that's weird. I usually like reading the whole book, But yeah, I'm a big fan of Sabriel. I don't actually think there's been any like movie adaptations or anything to this.
No, and Garth Nix, you were asking like what kind of magical system or world do I like? And I actually think that world is great.
Yeah.
I love the idea of having like the wall, and then on one side is like normal, kind of recognizable. I think it's like Britain. And then on the other side is like this magic land, right? And that concept I really, really like. And if I were going to write fan fiction, it would have that element in it.
You're going to write Sabriel fan fiction?
No, probably not. But if I were going to try and write my own fantasy book, I feel like I love that idea of like the wall separating the two places and then like magic on one side. And I like that, Nyx is dark, but not too dark.
Yeah.
So like you were saying, you don't want to just like wallow in sadness the whole time.
Yeah.
But it is pretty dark. Like I like how she goes into the realms of the dead, and like there's the 9 it's been a while since I've read it, but there's the 9 bells and everything. I think that whole idea is cool. And then Lyriel, which is another book in that series, features the library, which is like the dream library for all nerds. It's like the best sounding. I know you are not as big a library fan as me, but like I love a good library, and like the description of the library in that book is like the most amazing place that could ever be. So in terms of world building, I think he does a great job. His characters are really cool. I think he writes women pretty well.
Yeah.
So, in comparison to Robert Jordan sometimes.
Yeah. So I agree. I think you're right. I was thinking, I was like, I think this is the book that we both realized we were into fantasy. Like you talked about it, and then we got to go deeper into fantasy. For me, it's like kind of what I said about the moment I see, this story has elves, dwarves, and dragons, I'm really not interested. This one's different. It's like, hey, here's a main character who's a necromancer. It's like, that's not a main character, like, type. Right? Like it's this girl who's like trying to get her dad back. So the whole plotline, I was like, it's not like this heroic thing. Let's go and save the world. It's like, no, this girl's trying to save her dad, and she's a necromancer, not even by choice, kind of just like has to do it because her dad does it. And I thought that was a really cool plotline. Then the Lyriel and then Abhorsen is like, it's like her cousin or something, and then her son. Mm-hmm. I thought also it was pretty cool. I love the way. I think you're right. One of the things is like, when he like I don't I guess what I like about his writing style of women is not necessarily, I guess I'll say this. In the Wheel of Time, Elaine, Min, and Avienda, I forgot, are all in love with Rand, the main character.
Yep.
So half their dialogue is them making googly eyes at the main character.
So you're saying that it doesn't pass the Bechdel test.
It's a yes. There you go. That's what it is. Because it's annoying at some point where they're so involved in this character, and it's like it's clearly him living off a fetish. Which again, the book is good, and the main characters themselves, they all have their own good traits, right? Like they're all strong female characters. But
it is a little like I'm not saying that there could never be a circumstance where it would make sense to have like 3 really great female characters all sharing and in love with one guy. But it feels icky. I think you're right. And I don't even know, I couldn't quite say why, except that I think he kind of, because the books are so long, he very subtly leads you into it. And then by the time you get to the point where you're like, he's basically going to have like 3 girlfriends, how logistically is this even going to work? It just feels like you've kind of gotten into something you maybe didn't want to have to buy into.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So he said in an interview that he based it on his own life, that at some point there were 3 girls chasing him. I was like, yeah, right, dude. Yeah, I'm sure. Okay.
I mean, never know.
Yeah. But I think the thing that bothers me about that whole situation, and it's something that you notice in Sabriel, is that there's a fucking war going on. There's like this literally end of the world is coming, and these girls are like, I wonder if he likes me. And I'm like, dude, in Sabriel, she has a task. I gotta save my dad. And there's also a love story in Sabriel, but you can tell that her main focus is, hey, I gotta do this first. Like, I do like this guy, they flirt, and that's it. And this other one in Game of Thrones has this shit too, where it's just like, they make it too involved to the point where I'm like, yo, there's a couple of things that are pretty important that like, Are you really gonna be spending all your time thinking about boys and puberty and shit? Like,
yeah, I don't know, and I agree that like there's something about that feels a little off, like the tone of it. Like again, I guess there might be some like realistic, not icky way that you could write that, but it just feels weird the way that it came about. So yeah.
I just it felt like he wanted it too much. That's what I felt like.
So I guess like I'm not against having a romance in a fantasy book, even if there's a big war going on. Like classic, like Arwen and Aragorn are, great romance.
Yeah, it's great romance in quotation marks. Like I mentioned Elwyn like twice. It's like, all right, well, this is Elf.
I guess they're not a great romance. Like the book doesn't focus on them that much, but they're great romance in the sense that like they give up a lot. Well, particularly Arwen to be together, and it's epic, you know. And I'm like fine with that. I don't mind having some romance in a fantasy book, but I don't like it when it starts to get too. Like I don't really like sex scenes.
Oh, in books?
I'll put it that way. In books, yeah.
Remember? So I forgot what the book was called. I texted you a book that I was like, hey, have you heard of this book? And is it good? And you said, haven't heard great things about it. I forgot what the book was. So a coworker recommended me that book. And then she starts talking about it. And she's like, oh, it's very graphic. And I'm like, what do you mean graphic? It's like, oh, there's a lot of sex scenes in it. So I was like, okay. I mean, I don't necessarily like sex scenes either, I guess.
Wow, we sound very puritanical.
Yeah, okay, so I don't mind porn. I just like sometimes I'm reading about fighting a dragon. I want to, let's get to the fucking dragon, right? Like there's two different instances of how I'm feeling. So anyway, so she goes like, oh yeah, like the second book has like the last 2 chapters are like a very in-depth sex scene. And I'm like, whoa. How is this not an erotic novel at that point? Like 2 chapters worth of like...
Yeah, it just starts to feel a little bit like I've used the word icky a few times, but yeah, there's an ick factor there. That
yes. Becky's in her 30s, right? And I understand this is very icky stuff here.
Yeah. I do think like going back to Garth Nix, yeah, he is great. I wish he had written more. I don't know much about him as an author. So I don't know if you do. Like, is he alive?
Yeah, I don't. So I only read that the Old Kingdom trilogy, like the Sabriel, Lyriel, and Aporson.
Right.
I think he released another book called Clariel, which is a prequel to this. And I have another book by him called Across the Wall, but it's just like short stories.
Okay.
So I don't know if he's done much more than that. And again, I'm always surprised that Sabriel is either not a movie or a show. Like the book is great.
It would be great, and I think it would be so much easier to adapt than like
Wheel of Time. That's what I was thinking.
Did you try watching Wheel of Time?
Dude, that was a disappointment for me. Yeah. I apologize for people that liked it, but it was just...
Well, it was tough. Like, so I watched it with James, and he hasn't read the series, and I felt like I had to pause it like every 5 minutes to explain like some element of the backstory or like to express my outrage at the things that they had changed, where I was like, why did they change this? Like, this was fine the way it was before. Like, they made Perrin have this like tortured past where he had accidentally killed his wife, and like the characters were only supposed to be like 16, 17 in the book, and Perrin was not married. I'm sorry, I could go on about this for a while.
I know,
but it's weird. Like, why would you add that in? He was already like tortured enough already by being like a wolf man. He didn't need to have like this whole sad other thing happen to him.
So honestly, I thought it was shit. I watched an episode and a half. Hannah watched the whole thing and she liked it, but again, she didn't read the book. I watched it. Literally, the first thing I go and grab, what's the first book? The Eye of the World. And I'm like, fuck, Perrin had a wife? I don't even remember that. And I looked at the book, I'm like, no, they made that shit up. And then everything they were changing, like very little stuff. And I'm like, why would you take, what's the warder's name? Elias? Why would you take Elias out, who explains to Perrin that he's part like, I was like, that's a huge plot point. Why would you fucking like take that out?
And then there were other elements that they focused on like a lot, where I was like the warder, the like basically unnamed warder character whose Aes Sedai dies, and then kills himself. Like, that's not even really in the book. Or like, it's a very minor element. And I think it was basically an entire episode. And I just think if they're not going to move the plot along faster than that, then this series is never going to end. So why even invest the time in it's like we were saying before, why invest the time when like I don't think they're going to be able to make enough, like I don't know how many viewers you would need to have in order to support that show. And I didn't actually think that the visuals were that good. And apparently they spent like $100 million on that show or something like that. Yeah. And it wasn't even that beautiful. So,
well, talking about shows that spend a lot of money, we'll start wrapping it up soon. But you said you watched that's not the War of the Ring. What do they call it? The Ring of Powers, right?
Yes, I did.
I haven't watched it yet. What are your thoughts so far?
I am actually into it. Controversial choice, I know. And I know there's a lot of people who are like, oh, they're exploiting Tolkien. They're like making too many different things. But like, I like fantasy. If it's good, I'm going to watch it. Like, and I think it's fun. Like the Silmarillion is it's a very loose adaptation, like extremely loose. So I guess I think there's a lot of people who are mad because they're like, this is just not at all like the book.
No, you know what the Rings of Powers is based off? It's not based on the Silmarillion. And I think that's one of the reasons people are upset. It's based on the appendices of the trilogy.
Okay.
Which granted, the appendices are really long. There's like really big appendices there. But I don't know if it's enough to make like, what I say, like 5 seasons or something.
Is that how many they've committed to?
I think so.
I mean, I've only seen the first 3 episodes, I think. And so far, like, I'm into it. I like it. It's fun. I don't know what more you could really ask. So, and I don't think it's like disrespectful or anything, you know. We'll see. I mean, there are some elements, James and I have been talking about this because he's been watching it with me, where he feels that it's too moralizing at points and like that some of the emotional notes it hits are just like really basic. You said you haven't watched it yet?
I have not watched it.
Okay. Like, so there's some elements like where like one guy's father is dead and his friend is having like a problem with his father, and he says something like very twee, like, well, you should just remember that like I would give anything to be able to speak to my father again one more time, and like you don't like know how lucky you have it, which I feel like is a very like, it's been said before, right? So
yeah,
in that sense it is kind of like hitting a very typical note. But I think overall it's still good, or at least I'm liking it.
Did you watch The Witcher or did you read it?
I watched The Witcher and I have read the first book.
Okay. So I watched it, really enjoyed it, and I don't want to read the books until the show is finished because I feel like I'm going to read the book and then not like the show anymore.
I don't know. I've read the first book and I've watched the show and I didn't think it made me mad or did not like the show. So, okay. I don't know. I think you could safely read. You could try just reading the first book. They're quite short. So, you know, it would only take
like
you
2
like
years.
A couple months.
All right, Becky. So we're running up into the almost like an hour and 45-minute mark. Probably a little bit before that. I got to edit some stuff out. Now, I guess I'll let you ask any additional questions you have before. But just before we go, who's your favorite author and what's your favorite fantasy book or media? Doesn't matter if it's a movie or anything like that.
Oh, that's impossible. You know that's an impossible question. Do you actually have like one favorite that you think you could point to?
Okay, I don't know if I have a favorite book. Terry Pratchett is my favorite author for fantasy, like for sure.
He's definitely pretty high up there for me too.
His books just hit me right.
I don't know that I have one favorite, and you know who we haven't even talked about are like any crossover people who do like fantasy sci-fi, like Ursula Le Guin or anyone like that, who are like classics of their own genre. But I'm not going to.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's very unfortunate. This could have been like a 4-hour episode.
No, I'm running out of steam. So yeah.
No, I agree. I wrote a list of some of the books and authors I wanted to talk about. And it's like in one sheet, but it's 2 columns, and we only got through 1 column.
Oh my gosh! So I'll tell you, I'll give you a book recommendation instead of telling you my favorite, since that's going to be too hard. I will tell you my favorite thing I have read recently. I recommend it. Is called The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. So that one I think is pretty good. I think you might like it.
I think you would like Mistborn, FYI.
Okay,
Brandon Sanderson,
I'm writing
we
it
brought
down.
that up. Yeah. You're going to have to text me yours. That was too many words.
Okay. For your viewers out there who might need a good book recommendation.
If you like libraries, you ever saw the show Avatar: The Last Airbender?
No.
It's like a kids show. I think it's on Netflix too. It's a kids show. It has a lot of like kid plot lines, but it's still a pretty good show in general. And like the magic system there is like there's 4 elements, like the Aristotle elements, like water, fire, earth, and air. And like each certain people can control those elements, like one, except there's like one kid that can control all 4, and he's supposed to save the world. But anyway, the only reason I'm bringing one, it's good if you ever feel like watching a cartoon. That's one I would recommend. But one episode has a library. It's like a 2-part episode in the middle of the desert that has like all the knowledge. I think you would like that specific episode because it's like the library is run by an owl, and if you want to read a book, you got to bring in knowledge from outside the world to give it to him to trade in to be able to read it. I thought it was a clever plot line.
Cool. All right, you said I get to ask one question. So
okay,
all right,
ahead.
I've been thinking of what my one question should be.
I mean,
all right.
okay, you could ask more than one, but sure, go ahead.
But we want to end this thing. So, all right, here's my question, Gimo. If you had to write your own book, and you had to have your main character, and they couldn't be like a human. So they could be any of the like traditional like elf, dwarf, gnome, dragon, vampire, like anything like that. What kind of character would it be?
I'm assuming you as well, and anyone that reads fantasy, you probably already created some sort of fantasy world in your mind, or some plot line, or some stories. Because I'm assuming I'm going to ask you this question back to you, because once I give you an answer, I want to hear your answer.
Okay.
I always had like a couple of characters that I like, but one of the characters that I really like, and this is actually in Garth Nix. If you remember, I think Sabriel had like a friend that was a cat, and if you took off his collar, it would turn into a demon.
Yep.
So I always, in some of the stories that I came up with, I had something similar in the sense that it was like a toy soldier, like a little toy doll, about like a foot tall. Mm-hmm. And it was very similar that it would like behave like a little kid, but then would have this like demon inside of him. So it was basically like a doll with 2 souls in it, the soul of a kid and a demon. And then that would be one of the characters. Basically, I don't know if that's cheating because it's not a dwarf or an elf.
No, I just said like not a typical human. So, yeah. And I'm gonna cheat too because you can argue that mine is maybe a human, but I would envision it as a separate species from regular humans. Would be, as I told you, I'm really into the idea of like magical libraries, and so I have this idea of like these militant librarians who would be like, this like separate group of creatures who run the library, but like they're not like, how you think of a librarian as being very quiet and meek, and they just sit around, but they're like super intense and like tough and, get involved in all the politics of the world and everything. So I think that's where I'd want to sit if I were going to make my own book.
Yeah. Is that kind of like, if you were to write a book, would you think you would write it something about it like a librarian?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think it would be a magic library, and but it would be like, I don't know. Yeah. I'd have to think about it more in all my free time.
Yeah. All right, guys, you heard it from Becky. Expect her book, 2023? I'll give you to
No, you got to give me at least like 3 decades before I have enough life experience to write the book.
Listen, Christopher Paoloni barely was 15, and he wrote 4 books, dude.
Yeah, but now
putting us to shame.
Now I'm on record saying it was shallow, so I have to do a better job for my own.
All right. Okay. Anything else, Becky, before we call it quits?
No, thanks for having me on. This was super fun.
No problem. No, it was pretty fun. You guys get to hear a lot about fantasy. Again, Becky is the expert. I think she has a PhD or 2 of them in fantasy alone. So any questions directed to her?
But yeah, feel free. Gimo has my email address.
There you go. Any questions, I can send them over. All right, guys. The end. Thank you for listening to Under the Lid, produced by Rattail. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at RattailGames, and you can also email us at rattailgames@gmail.com. Visit our website, www.rattail.com. We'll continue our story next time. I usually don't do the outros, I forget. Go.
One.
You gotta wait for me to do it.
I thought we were just going right away. All right. Try again.
All right, every 2 seconds, right? Okay. So ready? And then we can just basically start going. I don't know if you had like a specific way you want to deal with it, or you wanted me to just start leading and talking.
Why don't you just start? I was hoping I would prepare more, but I really didn't. So we'll just have to talk.
Yeah. Listen, I can talk about fantasy for hours.
Okay. I've been watching the new. We can talk about the new like Lord of the Rings stuff because I just watched. Okay. I've been watching that.
Like Lord of the. You there?
I'm here.
Okay, I just heard a beep, so just.
I don't know. Maybe someone messaged me on Discord.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Quick side note. So we're at a 1 hour mark. I was thinking, how long do you want to record? Like,
I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on. So is there anything in particular that you like actually want to make sure we cover?
So I'm not rushing you, by the way. I'm just saying we can record up to like, usually like these Under the Lids go between an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 45 minutes. Is that okay with you?
Yeah,
or do you want to keep it a little shorter? Okay,
no, I'm
so
good.
we can keep it going. All right.
I've been waiting, Gimo. I've been waiting like years to get on this podcast. So people may not know. I'm gonna fill. This is under the lid. The backstory of this Under the Lid. So the only way I convinced Gimo to let me come on the show and talk about fantasy was that I got married a couple months ago, and I told him that as my wedding present, he had to let me come on the show.
You were gonna be welcome anyway, but now I didn't have to get you a wedding present. Count.
Exactly. This is also my wedding present. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Congratulations on the wedding again.
Thanks. Yeah. Right. It was not a Tolkien themed wedding, but it was still pretty good.
It was a little disappointing. It's because her husband is, instead of into fantasy, he's into military and like American history, which
right,
is
and it wasn't like a military themed wedding either. We split the difference by having the most bland possible wedding, no theme at all.
It's like Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett just averaged out to a regular wedding.
Exactly.